May it please you, Madam, you have already heard today that Mrs. Tracy Jenkins is seeking injunctive relief in the form of an occupation order with the power of arrest as per sections 33 and 47 of Part 4 of the Family Law Act of 1996. In addition, the applicant is asking Madam to consider the court's ancillary powers under section 40 of the same act. And lastly, Mrs. Jenkins is also seeking a continuation of a non-molestation order previously granted by the court under section 42 of that act. Now I will briefly address the court on each of these sections in turn. First, to the occupation order. It is submitted that the considerations in section 33(6)(a) to d of this act all fall in favour of making the order as requested. When considering the housing needs and the resources of both parties and of their children, it is clear that the respondent will be in a far better position to vacate the family home. This home is the property that both children have known and have grown up in, and the eldest daughter has recently started at the local school, and therefore it would not be desirable to move her at this time. Should the respondent be allowed to remain in the house, then Mrs. Jenkins would not have a suitable alternative. Her own parents live in Birmingham, some distance away from Bristol. They live in a two-bedroom house, and to accommodate three additional people would be extremely cramped and terribly unpractical. On the contrary, the respondent has already shown that he has some alternative means of accommodation, staying with his mother. It is acknowledged that while this may not be an ideal or even desirable living situation, it is submitted that this is the most practical alternative in the circumstances until matters can be further resolved in the process of the divorce proceedings. Now, when considering the financial resources of the parties, it should be noted that the respondent is in full-time and secure employment as an engineer, and therefore he would have the resources potentially to look for alternative accommodation should he not be able to remain with his mother. However, if we look to the resources of Mrs. Jenkins, we see a stay-at-home mum with full-time care of the two children. Now, naturally, she has no independent income and therefore would not be able to seek alternative accommodation in the form of a rental property. With regard to the likely effect on the health, safety and well-being of the parties, it is submitted that there is a very real concern that the respondent's pattern of behaviour is likely to continue, especially in the light of the divorce proceedings, which could have the effect of stimulating further intimidation or pressure on Mrs. Jenkins in order to drop that petition for divorce. There is also the particular concern for the children in that they have shown obvious signs of fear and have been present to witness acts of violence and intimidation and threats. The even greater worry, though, is that the respondent's pattern of behaviour could indeed escalate and therefore result in significant harm either to the applicant herself or to their two children. On the other hand, Madam, it is submitted that while the respondent's alternative living arrangements may not be ideal, they are far from likely to produce any adverse effects on his health, safety and well-being. And finally, to highlight the conduct of the respondent, Mrs. Jenkins' statement has described his repeated drunkenness, his threats, violence, intimidation, his belittling and controlling behaviour. Now, in addition, Mrs. Jenkins has also described to us his reluctance to be much involved with the raising of their two children and indeed has expected Mrs. Jenkins to take full responsibility for them. Madam, if I may now address you on the balance of harm test. It is submitted that the greater harm would be suffered by the applicant and their two children should an order not be made today. Mrs. Jenkins has highlighted the effects on her children so far in that they have witnessed and heard occasions of shouting and swearing and threats of violence, which would easily come within the definition of harm under section 63(1) of the Act. Now, in this case, it would be a potential for the impairment of their mental health or of their development. It is acknowledged that Madam will be concerned that there is another child to consider in this matter. The relevant child here would be the respondent's niece, who would be forced to share a bedroom with her mother should the respondent have to move in. Of course, this would be an imposition on that child. However, it is submitted that first, the respondent's need to reside there would be potentially short-lived whilst he found an alternative arrangement. But second, that while this is certainly not a desirable position for this child to be in, the alternative scenario would have a far greater impact on the health, safety and well-being of the two Jenkins children, who would either be exposed to threats of further violence and aggression and so on, or who would be forced to move away from their home, from their local network, from their friends and school, to live in conditions that would certainly be even more cramped. Madam, with regards to the application to have a power of arrest attached to the occupation order, the respondent has both used and threatened violence in the past, and therefore it is submitted that an occupation order should come with a power of arrest in accordance with Section 47. I will draw Madam's attention in particular to one of the most recent acts of violence which occurred in front of the children, where the respondent put his hands around Mrs. Jenkins' neck and shouted threats to kill. It is submitted that these events on their own are serious enough to warrant attaching a power of arrest. However, if Madam requires further persuasion on this matter, it should be noted that the respondent, having been served with a non-molestation order on the 21st of November, went ahead and acted in breach of this order a mere 2 days later. Once again, he used physical force, aggression, threats and verbal abuse in an attempt to intimidate Mrs. Jenkins. There is therefore a genuine concern that, having breached an order in the past that of the court, that there is a risk that, having done it once, he will of course do it again unless there is some further deterrent or sanction in place. Now, Madam, I'd like to address you briefly on the matter of an ancillary order under Section 40 of the Act. And should Madam decide to grant the application order, it is respectfully submitted that there should be an accompanying order to ensure that the respondent continues to meet his financial obligations to the applicant. In particular, the need for him to continue to pay the mortgage on their house. As Mrs. Jenkins is the primary carer of the two children and is unable to work, and indeed on her evidence she's been expected to stay at home in that traditional role, then she would have no facility for paying that mortgage or for paying any housing expenses or living expenses for herself or for her children. And in my submission there is a risk that the respondent could withhold money in these circumstances. And finally, Madam, on the matter of the continuation of the non-molestation order, you have already heard my submissions on the matter of the health, safety and well-being of both Mrs. Jenkins and of her children. But it is further submitted that the respondent has displayed a wide range of distressing conduct that would be enough to constitute harassment, such as standing across the street and making silent phone calls, as well as verbal abuse and physical violence, all of which have been significant enough in the past to call for the intervention of the court on this previous occasion. And therefore we would submit that this should continue. There has been no change in that circumstance. Now, Madam, before I conclude, I would like to address some of the points that have been raised by my learned friend today. With regard to Mrs. Jenkins' new relationship, it is submitted that she has been upfront with the respondent and with the court about the nature of this very new association. She has expressed in her statement that she has no immediate long-term plans for this relationship, and it is hoped that the court will take her statement at face value and her assurances in this matter. The respondent has, of course, made a number of conflicting assertions in his statements. Now, it is understood that in the absence of any corroborative evidence, we are left with a degree of he said, she said in this matter. Now, ultimately, however, even if it were the case that the respondent's version of events was the more true, the exclusion of him from the house at this point would not place him at any real risk of harm. On the other hand, if it were the case, as we submit, that the applicant's version of events is the more true, then the risk to her and to her children would be significant if the occupation order were not granted. In conclusion, Madam, it is submitted that Mrs. Jenkins requires the intervention of the court in order to protect her and her children from suffering any further harm.